Okay, I think it's a minute past 2. I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm extremely excited about the webinar. We had originally planned for February already, but now better late than never. We are able to have it in April. Thank you so much, Andreas, also for joining us today and spending your time with us talking about sustainability and strategy. Um, I Today is all about Viessmann and the journey that the company has been on over the course of the past couple of years, and the journey it starts to continue being on, as you, Andreas, will also I'm sure mention with some larger developments for the company in the field. I will start. My name is Sven. For those who don't know me, I'll start with a few words about agenda and what we do at Nordic Sustainability, and then pretty quickly hand over to Andreas to really guide us through what Viessmann has been doing over the course of the past few years. And then we have a question and discussion slot where I would love to ask some questions to Andreas before we open up to wider questions from you as participants. Now, we really want to make this session as useful to all of you as possible. So do feel free to use the chat function as we go through to ask any types of questions that might come into your minds as we go along. Some of those questions we might already take throughout the presentation, while some we might leave for the question answer slot later on. But I can assure you that there's a lot of transparency that Andreas is bringing into the session. So I think there's a lot to be inspired by and at least reflect on. So feel free to use that function. I think one question that always comes up is whether the webinar will be recorded and slides shared. Yes, we will be both recording the webinar and sharing the slides. And you can find the recordings, of course, we'll send them out as well, but you can also find the recordings in our YouTube channel under Nordic Sustainability, where you also find our past webinars. For example, we had another webinar on strategy with Vestas and Oatly in the fall. So as I just say a few words about Nordic Sustainability and our work in this field, I would also just ask you and invite everyone to write into the chat your name and the company that you come from or the organization that you come from. I think that both gets us a little bit acquainted with the chat function, but also with each other. So so I think yeah, feel free to just not jot down your name and the organization you're with. My 3 slides. For those of you who don't know us, we are a Copenhagen-based sustainability strategy consultancy. We really focus on getting our clients and helping our clients to transform towards a place where they operate within planetary boundaries. We are around 40 consultants right now, based here in Copenhagen. And always say we are sustainability experts first, consultants second, because we really try to stand for a science-based approach and excellence in what we work on. We usually help companies that we and our clients in conducting quite broad and detailed impact assessments to really help them understand where are the main impacts that they have as organizations, and from there develop strategies that are transformative in their approach and implementation programs to actually get those strategies to not just be KPI structures in different shelves, but also something that actually lives in the organization. I think, unsurprising disclaimer, we've had the pleasure of working with Andreas and his team on the Viessmann strategy. I think this is a really good example of what can come out of such a project when the stars align. I think typically, also, as I'm sure many of you who are in the audience today will find yourselves, if you work in companies, at the stage where you will have done some sort of materiality assessment. You'll probably be very aware of the type of image on the left, materiality matrix example. And what's really the key next steps for companies in the field is then to, of course, think about what do we do with all these results. And I think we see some companies going very much down the road of only looking at this as a compliance exercise, as a policy adjustment exercise, to make sure that the base targets are set and it goes into the operational running of the company. And while that is important as well, we see that there's also, of course, a more strategic space needed for companies to really look at which of these types of impacts are intricately linked to the way we do business, to our business model, where do we have the highest potential, of course, for also using sustainability as a value driver. And I know that word value driver is very often used and seldomly, I think, fulfilled. But I think that's also an area that we're only starting to reach right now. I think what we're really trying to get companies to understand is that in order, of course, to get some sort of value out of sustainability and build operational resilience for the companies in the future, what it needs is, of course, a more strategic approach to move the sustainability work of the company from one that is compliant focused, where you might have done a double materiality assessment, you might have done many of the base processes in place, but you need, or many companies need, a more proactive approach with much more operational targets that it sets to transform the company. Of course, a lot more transparency towards what type of activities are actually running and the benefits they provide to customers, and really the long-term vision of a truly sustainable company and how the company intends to transform to that goal. I think it's only when you get to that last step that you're really able to talk about actual resilience building and competitive advantage. So with those rather high-level words, I again invite all of you to ask any questions that you might have, and we'll hand this over to Andreas.
Yes, thank you, Sven, and thank you, Nordic team, for the invitation. Yeah, unfortunately, we had to postpone the webinar since I was off during the initially planned time. But the happier I am now to speak to you, to all of you, and hopefully get into a bit of a discussion in the second part of this, after I walked you through basically the journey we've been on with Viessmann over the last 2.5 years now, together with the Nordic team, which really became kind of an embedded part of my team, of my sustainability team within the company, as you will see in a couple of minutes. A couple of words before I get started, just a bit of a personal disclaimer here as well. The material you will see right now is basically reflecting the sustainability strategy of the Viessmann Group. The Viessmann Group in itself, as you might be aware, divested end of last year the biggest business unit, the Climate Solutions business unit, to Carrier Global Corporation. I went with that divestiture into the global carrier world, where I'm also now working on sustainability. But the majority of the slides you see today are really from that process, which kind of concluded end of last year, and we're now in the process of transforming a couple of these things into my new operational reality. So just keep that in mind, that everything I'm showing here is kind of backward looking, and it is in no way constituting any forward looking statements with regard to the business area Climate Solutions within the Carrier Global context. So with that, let's jump right into it with the next slide. So what I really wanted to give you a very quick overview on in the next 20 minutes or so is just a position of the business of Viessmann, and it's still accurate today as well. A quick glimpse into the product and service portfolio, the history in the introduction, and then I go directly into the strategy process, which we went through together with the colleagues from Nordic Sustainability. Next one. Yeah, so just briefly, again, looking back at the Viessmann Group, which is a family-owned, or was a family-owned business with over 100 years of history, employing over 14,000 people worldwide with a 4 billion turnover. So I'd say a decently sized family-owned business in Germany, operating obviously in as you can see in 12 different countries, and serving markets globally, mainly through a business model which is really B2B2C, so selling HVAC equipment to partners which then install it at residential scale mainly. That's really what the business was. And as you can see, these are fiscal year 2022 figures, which we reported in our 2023 sustainability report. Already back then, we were on a trajectory of what is a major part of the transformational journey to basically convert into a product portfolio which consists of products and services which run on renewable energy. So already back then, we were at a 50% quota on that journey, which was basically also accelerated with the strategy you're going to see a bit more about. If you go into the next slide, you just get a quick overview on the product and service portfolio, as we also published it in the sustainability report. So it's really different, market segments we're in. So obviously the heating, the cooling and air conditioning, electricity generation and storage and refrigeration, and obviously combining all that into kind of a building ecosystem for supply of heat, clean air, cooling, as well as clean water. That's really the core of the business. And again, the major part was focused on residential buildings, so residential scale like single family houses, but also multifamily houses, then commercial industrial buildings, districts of buildings, so district heating, and then also when it comes to refrigeration, obviously food retail stores or restaurants. So that was the scope of the Viessmann Group back then, again, until end of last year, when the biggest business unit, the Viessmann Climate Solution, which mainly consists of the residential and commercial industrial buildings, HVAC solutions, was divested into Carrier. But until then, it was basically this products and service portfolio. If you go to the next slide, you basically have a quick glimpse on the product on the company history. Again, we've taken this from our sustainability report, basically, showing in parallel a couple of sustainability milestones on the bottom. So you basically see, the company was founded in 1917 by the first generation, Johann Viessmann, and then progressed through 4 generations over the last 107 years. And again, obviously, it was very much focused at the beginning on fossil fuel heating systems, so boilers using solid fuels, liquid fuels, and then natural gas, evolving through that development, but also pretty early on adopting to technology innovations. So looking into the first heat pump, which was developed back in the 70s, and obviously also solar heating solutions. So that's basically depicted here. And what you can see there, obviously going through the 4th generation, the digitization obviously kicked in very clearly. Also service-based business models started evolving. As you can see here, climate as a service. We'll come to that in a bit more detail, maybe towards the end, how this is evolving, also in the context of circularity. And then back in 2021, when I started my professional journey with Viessmann, we started our sustainability strategy and implementation of that with our Leap to Net Zero climate strategy. So the first focus we set on really the most material impact, which is greenhouse gas emissions, obviously from our product portfolio. So we set a science-based target, and then from then onwards, we basically worked through the process, which I go through in some detail now, until end of last year, and now are now in the process, obviously looking in the biggest business area now with Carrier, how we can maintain some of the momentum we've built there, and then obviously also translate that into the new business reality. Going to the next slide. I wanted to, I always like starting with that slide, and for those of you who are scenario planners, you'll probably appreciate that. So this is really kind of the starting point we took when we started developing this idea of a holistic building block for the business strategy, right? So from the beginning on, we never called it sustainability strategy, but we really said, okay, what do we need to do to our business model to help transform the family-owned business with 100 years of history into something which is future fit, right? Which is basically adapting and addressing the challenges we're all facing from a sustainability perspective, right? And so that funnel obviously helps us to kind of visualize that and make it more tangible in terms of what we're aiming for. And one of the things you will notice here is obviously also somewhat related to the fact that we were able to do this in a family-owned business is really the multi-generation focus, right? So it was always kind of a look ahead, not only the next 2-3 years, but really look ahead 10 years and even further until the mid of the century, as you will see later, to basically see, okay, how can we live up to that purpose, which was and still is to create living spaces for generations to come, by also, taking this long-term holistic view and then breaking it down into more tangible and more, manageable short-term trajectories on targets. And what you can see here is obviously informed by the natural step ABCD backcasting approach and the Future Fit Business Benchmark Toolbox, which was one of the tools we used to basically get started on this, and which helped us tremendously to really structure this in a very thought through way and help break down these planetary challenges, which you can see in the trajectories here, into the business reality we're facing. So that's really how we got started, to basically line out a couple of scenarios which would lead the business into this high risk trajectory, which was basically equivalent of the business not meeting these break-even goals as defined by the Future Fit Business Benchmark. And then obviously we were able to depict a break-even trajectory to identify, okay, what are the things, the levers we need to push to basically get the negative impacts we have, the most material negative impacts we have, addressed over the next couple of years. And then obviously on the positive side, right, I mean, if we look at the positive pursuits as defined there, which are basically nothing else than defining, okay, what do you need to be your business at to become part of the solution, to basically retract behind planetary boundaries again over the next couple of decades with the business model you're operating, right? So that's really how we framed it, and how we also, help to get buy-in from senior leadership to basically look into this very holistic and science-based approach, which, by the way, was obviously a perfect training for CSRD, right? I mean, as you will see throughout the presentation, if you look at the toolbox, which is one of a couple of toolboxes which are out there, and compare that to what is now kind of in the statutory requirements of the ESRSs and CSRD, you will find a lot of similarities. So I guess since we started that process back in 2021, when the CSRD and the ESRSs were not finalized, it was really the perfect toolbox to get started with the ambitions we had to have a science-based strategy addressing the whole value chain with a long-term holistic perspective on these intertwined challenges which come out of the sustainability challenges we're all facing. So if we go to the next slide, I would basically walk you very quickly through that canvas which we used. So these are real slides we also used in the sustainability engagement, obviously with our leadership, but also then with the subject matter experts. So we basically combined a top-down with a bottom-up approach to get to what you will see at the end, the building block with very concrete measures as well. So as explained, right, so obviously we have the global SDG agenda 2030, the megatrends, the interconnected sustainability challenges depicted there and closely linked, obviously, to the planetary boundaries. And a clear, compliance need, but also a need to basically develop the ideas, what we need to do to basically turn the current operating model into a trajectory which basically leads us into that yellow zone or even that green zone if we want to continue being around for the next couple of generations. So that's how we started. So as I said, we had in 2021 already a commitment for the science-based target for the climate strategy and report. And then basically we started that journey of developing this broader framework together with Nordic Sustainability after agreeing with the executive leadership board to fill these other gaps which are depicted there in the white box in the middle, addressing all the other challenges which are visible in the planetary boundaries model and depicted in the KPIs defined in the Future Fit Business Benchmark. So going to the next slide, you basically, obviously this is a bit of an eye chart, so I will definitely not go through this, but this is basically, how we solved and basically explained why we're using this toolbox. I mentioned the Future Fit Business Benchmark to our leadership team. So the why, the what, and the how. I think, you can basically go through that if you want later on. But this is basically how we framed it and how we also, got buy-in into into using that framework. I think the next slide and the following slides will make it a bit more visible and tangible from that perspective. So we started on that journey in basically using a 3-step co-creation model. Those 3-step model was basically based on a couple of prerequisites and basic principles. So the Viessmann values obviously were core to this. The aspiration to use science-based models, so really have science-based approaches, and as I mentioned before, have an approach which covers the whole value chain, all business areas, and creates a building block for the group strategy, right? So really be interwoven with the business strategy. That was the basic principle we started off with, and then obviously the prerequisites reflecting business reality. So the targets contribute to the long-term purpose, co-creating living spaces for generations to come, and also are understood as being guiding stars, right? So I think it's clear that in sustainability management, we always have to take iterative approaches, and we have to, obviously navigate a landscape which is classified by changes you can't really foresee. So it's really kind of, defining these signposts and also the North Stars, let's say, to orient, and then to obviously ensure midterm resilience and commercial opportunities, which goes hand in hand with that transformation and going into that green area of the positive pursuits, and obviously aligning it with business realities, compliance, and different organizational speeds, which I think is also very important aspect, since, as you have seen at the beginning, we had different business areas and obviously, differently operated, a very decentralized approach, which kind of grew organically over the last 100 years. So adjusting to that was also very important, because in fact, we were the only, department internally which was that central as, as a sustainability function was. Going to the next slide, briefly walking through that co-creation step. So the first step was really using the benchmark baseline assessment to understand the societal impact, positive and negative, and engage the organization. And if you go to the next slide, you basically see how we started that. And again, I mentioned we combined a top-down approach, engaging with the leadership team, with a bottom-up approach, where we really went into the organization and got the subject matter experts from the different functions engaged and basically really tapped into their knowledge and long-term history of the company, right? So as you can see here, over 14 subject matter experts involved in that, 19 different functions, and applied this framework of these break-even goals on do no harm indicators as well as do more good indicators in terms of positive pursuits. If you go to the next slide, you basically see a summary slide, which was a big revelation, a big step for Viessmann back then when we revealed it, right? And I mean, talking now in 2024, obviously in the time of double materiality assessments, this was probably not as revolutionary, but back in 2021 or beginning of 2022 when we did this, it was a big step change in the organization, because until then it was always a narrative within the company on, hey, we're actually doing good, right? We are sustainable, we're providing more efficient solutions, we have incremental improvements on our product portfolio, we're focusing on scope 1 and 2 on the manufacturing, we're more energy efficient, more water efficient, less waste, but we didn't look at the whole value chain, right? So once we basically finished the baseline assessment, looking at the whole value chain, it became actually very clear that we're not a sustainable company. And that was a big revelation and also a big change in terms of narrative, which we had to accompany, obviously, with a couple of initiatives, which you will see later in the different building or focus areas, to also help explain and educate people within the organization. Okay, why is that, right? And what does it mean? And how do we actually address it? And also, obviously, putting up the bigger picture that actually, most of the companies in today's economic system are not sustainable, right? So I think this was a very important aspect in the journey of communicating that to the broader organization. If you now go to the next slide, you basically moving on in co-creation step 2. And that is really now, okay, we've done the baseline assessment. We understand we're not sustainable yet, but we also understand what levers, we have to address to move forward. Obviously, being a company and not having unlimited resources, we had to set direction and focus on the most material topics to develop initiatives and resource requirements and an operational sequencing, which actually can be embedded in the business strategy, right? So it was not enough to just say, okay, by 2030, we want to be there, by 2050 there, but we also wanted to basically get back to senior management to basically explain, okay, this is the steps we can tangibly take over the next couple of months, the next couple of years to move us in the right direction, as this is really the process which will take most resources and most time requirement to really change and embark on that transformation. So going to the next slide, you basically see how we approach that. So that was obviously the most intense phase basically in between the implementation phase and the baselining phase. And again, it was even more subject matter experts involved, different functions. And one of the recipes for success here was really to invite workstream co-leads on specific areas, which came out of the functions, right? So it was no longer a sustainability team-driven exercise, but it was really driven by supply chain experts, by engineering experts, by product development experts, by marketing experts, to really co-lead these work streams in tandem with the embedded team from Nordic, as well as my sustainability team, to really get into, okay, what are the impacts, what are the resources we need, and what are the initiatives we concretely identify for the next couple of years, which we can then put into the business planning. So as you can see, a very comprehensive exercise, which went on for a couple of months to basically get to what you will see now on the next slide. Okay, first of all, this is the materiality matrix. Sorry, I forgot that this was in here. So this is basically an overlay of the different layers of materiality assessment we did. So we looked obviously at the break-even goals and identified the most material topics in terms of risk of society and risk to business. And then we basically overlaid that with an external materiality assessment we did with stakeholders. So the typical, stakeholder materiality assessment to basically identify from that perspective what are the most material topics, and then inform the organization on, okay, these are the focus areas we should look into in terms of, getting more concrete and prioritizing activities. Going to the next slide. So you remember that was kind of the canvas we started with at the beginning. So now we basically were at the point that we, had a proposed sustainability building block, which included the climate strategy, to basically say, okay, we have identified 3 focus areas in this building block, which are all supporting, our trajectory to break even and to positive pursuits, and a number of enablers, which are kind of cross-cutting and cross-organizational, which you can see here. And going to the next slide, you will basically see that in a bit more detail. So this is basically the building block, and hopefully it can be read, but you will get the slides anyway. So what you see here is really the same approach I explained at the beginning, right? So we have kind of a visionary target set for 2050 on the focus area net zero, on the focus area circularity and the focus area supply chain. And then that is broken down into more tangible short-term targets in 2030. And what you will see in the next couple of slides is how that is then again broken down into directly operational targets for the next couple of years. But before we go there, just very briefly, so obviously on net zero, no surprise here, net zero business and value chain, a science-based target as well as a net zero commitment. So reducing by 2030 scope 1 and 2 emissions by at least 48%, as well as a scope 3 emission intensity target by at least 55%. That was already set and was obviously included, and given the sheer impact of that area with 108 million tons of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, in our base here, that was very clear, the highest impact area and the highest focus area. Second one, circularity, I think also not surprising for those of you in discrete manufacturing, where, you know, buying resources, components, OEM parts, and then putting them together, putting it in very long-lived equipment, put it on the market, and then, you know, basically use quite a bit of steel, metals, other materials for that. So obviously, developing circular business models was a key focus as well to basically decouple us from negative impacts. So as you can see here, we broke that down into three sub areas where we say, okay, we focus on product design, we focus on circular business model development, and we focus obviously on on zero waste operations, on product design, and you'll see that in a minute. That was also one of the very tangible direct actions we took out of this strategy to develop a sustainable design guideline, also with the help of Nordic Sustainability, and pilot that now for the next generation heat pump product. For circular business models, again, also looking into, okay, how can we go from, you know, climate as a service into net zero as a service, right? So really understanding what is needed from a business perspective to offer a net zero as a service to residential customers. And then for operational waste, obviously very straightforward, to eliminate all waste which cannot be repurposed, and repurposing being understood in the widest sense, encompassing all the dimension of the famous Alan MacArthur butterfly, you know, obviously the high value loops of repair, remanufacturing, but then also at the end, the loop of material recycling. Last focus area, again, also a very important area for discrete product manufacturing, is the supply chain. So it was over 12,000 tier one suppliers, global distributed tier one suppliers. It was obviously very important for us to understand and implement an effective governance system to ensure that we have zero harm in our supply chain. Again, a very ambitious target, given the fact that, you know, a lot of these impacts are not yet known. And we basically said, okay, we need to really step up here, also in line with legal requirements from the LKSG in Germany and the future CSDDD in Europe, as well as other global requirements, to really ensure we have an effective governance system there. And then obviously the enablers, which are the foundation and also play a very important role, is obviously this will only work if my function is basically redundant in 5 years. So all the people in the organization take up the aspects relevant for their job to transform. So obviously working with the people, with the colleagues, explaining what we're doing and involving them in these processes was a crucial aspect. Then governance, obviously this will only work if we have a tangible, measurable framework we can be held accountable for and also report on. And then data, obviously, as every one of you will probably know, ensuring effective sustainability data systems which cover the whole value chain. So basically know your molecules and electrons from source to source, but also understand, you know how you employ people, what kind of social data is affecting the footprint of your product is an important aspect. And that is obviously another critical enabler we're working on continuously. Okay, going to the next slide. Yeah, okay, I already went through that, so this is just magnified. So, you know, before closing, I really wanted to, you know, go that final step and give you a bit of more granularity on, you know, what was then defined also in the third phase, where we basically looked into, okay, concretely, what kind of initiatives are there for a specific focus area? And I picked circularity here. And then what can we prioritize and take forward? So if you go to the next slide, you basically see how that looked like. So again, breaking down in these three areas I already went through, circular business models, product design, as well as zero waste operations. Obviously, you know, we had this 2050 outcome target, 2030 outcome target, a KPI defined, and then group sets of projects, right? And that was really key to get buy-in, also top down from the leadership, to basically give them a clear estimate. Okay, this is the resources we need. This is the amount of CapEx and OpEx it will entail. And this is basically what we can get to. So on the next slide, you basically see a summary of of how that looked like, of what we worked on together with the Nordic team, and obviously the subject matter expert from the different functions. So you remember there were these boxes A, B, C, D, and so on under the different focus areas and sub-focus areas. So what we did was basically schedule a project plan for these different initiatives, which you can see here. And as you can look in there, I mean, each line item basically is a project in itself. And that's also how you can see how the resources add up, right? So it is actually an effort where really this can no longer be done by just a central function, but it's really a clear need to embed this into the daily operations and start transforming processes, start transforming the work the functions are doing to basically ensure that we get on that trajectory towards break even. So that's basically how we have structured that. And just to basically give a quick glimpse into that final phase. Obviously, we presented that, we got buy-in from senior management, and then obviously it was a matter of, again, going back to the prerequisites we said at the beginning. Okay, we can't do everything at once, right? And if you remember, if you look back at the last 2 years, especially in Europe, we had a lot of disruptions, which also affected all business value chains. So we obviously also had to prioritize and select a couple of key initiatives, which basically are cross-linked to a lot of these other initiatives. So obviously out of this long list, we selected a number of initiatives which are now being implemented in the business area I'm in right now, as well as in the remaining Viessmann group. And one of the initiatives I want to line out here, where we also got great support from the Nordic sustainability team, was actually the development and implementation of a sustainable product design guideline, which we now included in our product development process and all the internal processes, which is a stage gate process. And basically in every stage, we now have the sustainability criteria implemented in very concrete specifications, in requirements which the engineers can take and all the different other functions can take and test out in the development of the next generation of the heat pump, as I mentioned. And in parallel to that, to just close that loop I mentioned at the beginning, we also worked on a training module, which we call V-Skill, right? So it's a reskilling, which is being rolled out across all the different functions. So we started with the sales team, and now we're working through the different cohorts of engineers and engineering functions, which really explains what this sustainable design guideline entails, what the background is, on what trajectory we are, and why it is important. So developing this reskilling material, which was also supported by Nordic, is another very crucial puzzle piece in making this a success and basically engaging the organization on this journey and implementing it, right? So that's what I wanted to share. I hope I'm still in time. Yeah, looks like it. So thank you very much for your attention, and now looking forward to some questions and discussion.
Thanks so much, Andreas, and thanks also again for the kind of transparency you show. I think I attend a few of these kinds of webinars, and it's rare that companies are able to be this transparent about what actually went on. I have a few questions, but in the interest that also and the reflecting that our chat function didn't work just from the start of the meeting, maybe I'll take one of the questions first that's come in right now, also to encourage everyone to ask some more questions that might have come up in between. Danielle has asked how many congratulated you on the work and asked how many people are working in the sustainability department, and how long did it take to define the strategy as a whole?
Okay, so maybe starting from the end there. Defining it was basically an exercise of about 1.5 years, I would say. And that included obviously also setting the first concrete initiatives on the rails and getting started on those. And again, the recipe for success is here really that, we very early on started engaging the subject matter experts from the different functions, and also implemented a governance structure, which was based on our internal integrated management system, where we in a regular way communicated, where we are on the journey and what are we planning and where are we going, right? So that they can also start planning resources and allocating resources. So I think the size of the team, I don't know. I mean, that was really like 4 people, right? So that's really what we have in the team, and again, somewhat evenly distributed across the different focus areas, right? So we have one expert really focusing on scope 1, 2, and 3. We have one expert focusing on the circularity and engineering principles, and one expert in my team focusing on supply chain, human rights, and environmental due diligence. And then, another colleague, which basically brought together all the knowledge on governance, people, and data. So that's really very well depicted also in the building blocks. So it's 4 people, and then obviously the subject matter experts you basically see lined out here, and the resources required for these initiatives.
Thanks, Andreas. One thing I'm curious in also, because again, I think in terms of the ambition level of the strategy and the kind of transformational aspect from it, could you talk to a little bit more about how you think that came about? Was it good communication? Was it just also being lucky that it is a value-driven, family-owned company? Or what can we learn from, I think, the kind of ambition level that we ended up with?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both, Sven. So first of all, a critical enabler obviously was that it was a family-owned business, right? So the owner family basically was fully bought into that approach in looking into a very ambitious framework. As I said, the Toolbox, the Future Fit Business Benchmark, is very ambitious in the type of assessments you do, and also willing to or the willingness to accept that obviously the outcome of a baseline assessment will not be, all positive, right? But it will show, okay, we have a long journey ahead of us. So that buy-in and the ability for the owner family to basically decide and say, hey, yeah, this is what we go for, I think it was a critical enabler. And obviously communicating before that, convincing on the framework to use was part of that success. So I think that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is indeed that longer-term focus, which I think is pretty common, at least in the German Mittelstand, I would say, right, where you basically look into this generational perspective, right? So you not so much look into the next quarter or just the next year, but you really think about, okay, what do I need to do to ensure that in 5 years from now and 10 years from now, when the next generation will start getting into the company, can actually work on that. So I think these 2 aspects were critical enablers for this. And again, looking at the developments which happened since end of last year, it was obviously also a very good starting point to really get an internal due diligence on the sustainability performance, which obviously I don't know, but probably also helped in discussions with this new global partner in terms of explaining, okay, this is the trajectory we're on.
That makes a lot of sense. And you already mentioned the overlaps to ESRS. Do you think where do you think might there be differences? Would there be differences with ESRS now if you'd known about it coming, or how do you think that kind of aligned?
Yeah, so I would think, I mean, obviously there were drafts already floating around already back in 2022, right, on ESRSs, but I felt back then that this was kind of the perfect preparation for the ESRS, right? So in today's situation, if I would start that process, I would obviously have a very close look into the prescribed kind of disclosure requirements, the KPIs needed in there, and then see how can I map systematically kind of the break-even goals and the positive pursuits into these groups of ESRSs, because that will obviously help and create a lot of synergies in future reporting requirements, right? So we're kind of doing that now reversely, right? So we're looking into, okay, we've done the future fit assessment. How can we now use the metrics we have there to inform what we are going to report in terms of narrative, in terms of semi-quantitative data into the ESRSs, right? But from today's perspective, I would obviously start off with the compliance baseline, going through the materiality assessment, which I still think going, you know, a little bit, or no, again, I mean, if you look at the materiality assessment guidance from the EFRAG, it's not all black and white, right? So you have some degree of freedom to decide, okay, how do you want to approach that? And I think there a tool like FFPB could be very useful, right? So that's how I would see it today.
Thanks. We have a few questions now on the whole circularity materials bit. And one is about the more business model side. Maybe we start there. And
Sure.
someone asks, how is the climate heat as a service business model planned according to returning, taking back those systems? And how will the systems be reused, repurposed, recycled? Are they modular or are updates possible? So straight to the heart of the service question.
Sure. Yeah. So the overarching idea is really to think about it in a way that you know, the asset of an HVAC system, which you would basically install in your residential home, obviously requires a pretty high amount of capex from the owner to basically buy the equipment and then get it installed. And the idea of that business model is obviously that the asset itself stays with us, right? Stays with the company, and then we're offering kind of the heat or the cooling or the clean air if it's combined with a ventilation system, or the electricity from a PV system as a service, right? So it's kind of, think of it like a flat rate you have, and then the asset itself remains in the ownership of a service company. And then over a certain lease period, you basically get that service. And again, thinking forward, obviously that service would not only be heating or cooling or climate as a service, but it would be net zero as a service, right? Because guess what? If we kind of, you know, own the system and basically are able to optimize the balance between, you know, using the heat pump, using vehicle to grid, you know, buffers, using battery storage, using PV systems, solar thermal systems, and then looking at this on a district level, right? Combining these flexibilities you have with multiple of these systems combined, and having a lever there in you know, a business model you have with the distribution system operator on offering grid flexibilities and so on. So that's really the way we're looking at it right now, to see how can we optimize the performance of these assets, which you know, we continue to own, to basically not only offer these energy services, but also offer these at net zero emissions, right? And optimize the use of green electricity from the grid, self-generated green electricity, combine that with PPAs, combine that with other sources, so that ultimately we can develop a perspective towards net zero as a service. So that's really the idea, right? And I think we've seen a lot of these service-based business models occurring, right? It's nothing new. It's just that we need to combine the different complexities here in operating in this interconnected environment, and obviously having to manage a couple of stakeholders. But that's ultimately the idea, that the asset itself remains in the ownership of a company, and basically is then being able to be taken out at end of life, and being, you know, repurposed. And obviously that's where it ties into what we just discussed on the circular design guideline, right? So obviously this only makes sense if from the beginning on the product is designed in a way that you can actually close the value loops at end of life very easily, right? So you have in itself a very strong interest as the manufacturer. If you think about, hey, I'm going to maintain ownership on that asset, to construct in the way that it's repair friendly, that you can actually access critical components very quickly, that you can basically fulfill all the upcoming eco-design requirements from the horizontal standard upfront, because it's actually giving you an advantage because you're able to, you know, reduce your operating costs, right? And then also work with your suppliers, and that's kind of where I want to end this answer, in designing components which you purchase, be it pumps, be it heat exchangers, be it expansion vessels, be it electronic components, so that they actually can go into a value loop, which is not material recycling, which is kind of the worst thing which could happen, that you put everything in a shredder and then try to sort out the different elements, but that you basically say, hey, if I design my PCB in a way that I can flip it out, right? That I can change it out and can upgrade it. Or if I design my pump in a way that I can take out the magnets in a way that they can directly be repurposed or put in the remanufactured pump, that's where you can generate these value loops. And otherwise, if you don't do that, then this service-based model will not work.
Thanks. I think that relates to another question here about, have you looked into opportunities to sell waste to be used as raw materials for others? And if so, what were the main barriers? But I think to your answer right now, it's more about reusing it yourself at this point, right?
Yeah, no, it's about reusing it ourselves and giving access to our OEMs, to our suppliers, to get their materials back as well, because that's where they're struggling as well. Again, I mean, the current model, which is also kind of framed by the WE regulation, is okay, you collect everything and then you do some pre-sorting into material fractions, but at the end, when it comes to metals, you throw everything in a shredder and then you figure it out afterwards, right? So that's kind of where you disseminate the different elements as much as possible from a thermodynamic point of view and make it more difficult to really maintain value. And that's really where we need to slowly but steadily, crawl up the chain to understand, okay, what kind of components can we put into a better value loop than just selling the material value to third parties, right? Which basically then do the recycling for us. But obviously that's kind of the status quo we're at. Obviously the scrap value is something where our partners at the moment that's the only benefit they get at the moment, right? So if an installer comes to a residential home to replace a heating system, and we've kind of sampled also as part of this project a couple of areas in Germany and also in other European countries. What typically happens is that installer has kind of a scrap dealer at hand, in his phone, calling the scrap dealer, hey, I have something here. Scrap dealer comes, puts it in his pickup, and it's gone, right? And that's the black box. So we have no visibility at all what happens there. And again, also our partners, it's completely different. Some partner might get a currywurst, right, for the scrap. Some partner might actually have a revenue stream out of that, but it's completely opaque, right? They don't really know. And that's really where we're trying to slowly get into understanding, okay, what are, value carriers we can take out of that and also develop into these new business models.
Thanks, Andreas, and thanks for bringing the word currywurst into our webinars. I think that's the first. I think one of the really interesting things for me about this is that, of course, also as a company, you have very much this long-term view about, you're not alone in this world, and a lot of things need to change for you to be able to provide net zero as a services, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like you have a very tactical approach and long-term approach to what needs to change and how you can affect that change. Do you think that's again coming from this generational view that's also just typical in the company, or what might other companies be able to learn from that? Because I do think that's probably quite reflective of what most companies that need to adjust their business model actually need to do. But I see few examples of companies actually trying to plan for that quite strategically.
Yeah, no, I think it's a bit like these communicating pipes, right? So you need to think both things at the same time, right? And just this morning I was in the U-Bahn on the way to the office. I was reading one of the recent blog posts from John Elkington, where he kind of reflected on, hey, what is a recurring topic is really that the markets we operate in have to change as well, right? And that it's simply not enough to just focus on your own kind of corporate bubble in this transformation, but you basically need to also reach out. And again, it comes back to that system model, right? The corporation in the middle, and then you obviously have your concentric circles around you, and you need to find ways to reach through to these concentric circles with the models you operate. So involving the value chain is one aspect, but obviously it needs to go hand in hand. And that's, I mean, you see there, I mean, there are so many different functions involved in strategic standardization. You need to set the technical standards in a way that you're actually able to offer, for example, flexibility services with your heat pump to the distribution system operator, right? You need to, at the same time, ensure that you can use certain system combinations, right? That, the whole vehicle to grid discussion, right? I mean, all these things need to happen kind of in parallel so that the market around you evolves as well to be able to accept your new offerings, right? And to be able to realize these USPs you're defining in your little corporate bubble, right? So I think
And
that is indeed something where you need to align the functions. And I'm always using that term. You need to basically have a kind of a scientific diplomacy approach, right? Because you need to talk to so many different functions, to internally but also externally. And it's always balancing out, okay, what am I pushing for in the regulatory framework through my public affairs team, and what can I already foresee in terms of changes which are coming, and then how do I influence industry associations and standardization bodies in that direction. So I think that's hopefully not too confusing, but that's the way we're trying to approach it.
and can you connect that for the last few minutes maybe to the value chain approach? Because of course value chain also now with ESRS is getting a lot more focused. And I think there's a few questions still in the inbox about the main challenges about setting goals across the value chain, but actually also implementing these. Could you add a few more words to that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean that is indeed one of the major challenges, right? I mean, let me start downstream, right? So as I mentioned, we have a B2B2C business model, right? So the customers of Viessmann are basically about 80,000 installers, which do installations of residential systems, right? But when I say residential systems in that context, it's really most of the time it's really replacing an old boiler with a new boiler. I mean that's traditionally what over the last 50 years was done in that business, right? And what we're facing right now is indeed a new kind of system, right? Because now we're discussing not only replacing an old boiler with a new one, which is a bit more efficient, but really replacing the concept of how that service of providing heat and clean water and warm water and clean air is being done in a residential building, right? So you need a completely different skill set. So what I mentioned at the beginning on the reskilling we do internally, we obviously also have a huge program on reskilling the installers at a global level, right? Where we had 10,000 and more participants already over the last 2 years to really get that electric interconnected system idea out there, which is also branching different crafts, right? In the past, it was really mainly about heating and water installation. Now you basically need to have a system electrician in there as well, right? And you basically also need to empower the installer to basically understand, okay, what are the system implications? How do I size this system to optimally ensure that the battery size is sufficient, the PV system size is sufficient, and the heat pump is not overrated, because otherwise the economics will not work out. So I would say that is really a major challenge in the downstream when thinking about the value chain, and then also understanding, okay, what are the needs there from the downstream partners in terms of being participative in these new business models, right? Because the last thing we want is to basically cannibalize our customers' business models, right? So we need to find ways how to make them participate in that. And then on the upstream side, I mean the challenge is very similar, as most of you will probably know. I mean 12,000 tier 1 suppliers, and then going down into tier N in a global supply chain. Obviously, first of all, understanding really, and it comes down sometimes to really understanding, okay, where do the molecules actually come from, right? And what is actually in our products is already a challenge sometimes, right? To create a comprehensive life cycle inventory, which enables an LCA and a hotspot analysis, and then prospective, LCA in terms of improving. That is a lot of work where we obviously need to slowly but steadily reach out and scale educating our suppliers, right? And obviously the legal baseline also evolves, right? I mean, if you look at CBAM, if you look at the future deforestation regulation, the human rights due diligence requirements, all these things evolve in parallel. So there's also a massive need for the supply chain organization to basically engage that upstream part of the value chain and make sure that there is goal alignment. And obviously, it's as I said, it's an iterative process, and we also have setbacks where suppliers simply say, "Hey, we're simply not there. We can't do it right now," and that's basically one of the challenges we're obviously facing, like every other discrete manufacturer, I think.
That makes sense. I think we have one more question that I'd love to take. For everyone else who already has to leave us and go to run off to other meetings, thanks so much for joining today. I hope you took some learnings and inspiration with you. Maybe the last question is that around the kind of potential difference of being a family-owned business versus one that has investors, right? So do you think there's a connection between Viessmann, and Viessmann being potentially more able than others to invest patient capital into more ambitious targets and have that long-term view, also from a financial funding side?
Yeah, I would subscribe to that. I mean, I'm not a financial expert, right? And I'm not a lawyer, but I would say that, you know, the ability to basically take a longer term vision into account and not being bound by rather strict, you know, shareholder requirements is probably, you know, a degree of freedom which comes with a family ownership, right? And which also removes some of the constraints you will have, obviously, from a legal side, from a disclosure side, from all these other things which come when you're publicly listed, you know, and make it possible to really also take a more a bolder approach, let's say, right? I would subscribe to that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Andreas. Thanks again, everyone who was online. We'll close it here. I think it's very clear there's enough material to fill another of these sessions. But thanks so much, Andreas, for joining us today.
Sure.
And good luck, everybody, on your CSRD work and strategy work that I'm sure is going to start very soon after this.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone.
Okay. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye. Thank you.